The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, sealed with wax the colour of dried blood, and stamped with a crest that made the footman's hands shake as he carried it up the narrow stairs of a townhouse that had, only a year before, belonged to one of the most respected families in the county. He did not know what the letter contained. He knew only that it came from Ashford Hall, and that nothing good had ever travelled from that house to this one. Inside a modest sitting room, its curtains drawn against a cold grey morning, sat Miss Clara Winslow, 22 years of age, her dark hair pinned severely away from a face that had, in recent months, learned to give nothing away. She turned the letter over twice before breaking its seal, some old and unshakable instinct warning her that whatever the Duke of Ashford had written, it had not been written out of kindness. She was correct. The letter, brief and cutting in its formality, informed Miss Winslow that the Duke had decided, in his infinite and well-publicised wisdom, to grant her a small property on the edge of his estate, a crumbling manor called Holloware, abandoned for the better part of 2 decades, its fields barren, its roof collapsed in 3 places, its name spoken in the village only in tones of pity or ridicule. He offered it, the letter stated plainly, as a fitting inheritance for a young woman who believes herself wiser than her betters. It was not a gift. Everyone who read it, including Clara herself, understood precisely what it was: a punishment dressed in the language of generosity, a public humiliation delivered with the cold precision of a man who had never once been forced to answer for his own cruelty. She did not yet understand how deeply personal that cruelty truly was, nor how much the Duke himself had staked upon her failure. To understand why a Duke as powerful as Sebastian Ashford would trouble himself with the ruin of one young woman, one must first understand what had passed between them 3 months before: a single evening, a single public refusal, and a wound to his pride that he had nursed ever since with the quiet, patient fury of a man unaccustomed to being told no. Before that story unfolds, and before we follow Clara Winslow into the ruin that waited for her at Holloware, take a moment now, in these first few minutes, to press the subscribe button, so this channel's stories of fallen fortunes and quiet triumphs continue to find you. And while the tale is still gathering itself around you, leave a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. It is a strange comfort, in a story about isolation and cold country houses, to know how many warm rooms across the earth this candle is being read in. Now, let us return to the woman the Duke believed he was breaking, and to the evening that made an enemy of him in the first place. Clara Winslow had not always lived in a townhouse too small for the family portraits still hanging upon its walls. A year earlier, she had been the eldest daughter of Sir Henry Winslow, a gentleman of good name and comfortable fortune, whose modest estate had bordered the vast Ashford lands for 3 generations without incident or rivalry. Sir Henry had been, by every account, an honourable man, careful with his tenants, generous with his neighbours, and entirely unprepared for the particular breed of ruin that arrives not through poor harvests or bad investment, but through the deliberate malice of a more powerful man. The Duke of Ashford had wanted Sir Henry's land for years, a strip of fertile river frontage that would have completed his own holdings into one unbroken stretch of the finest agricultural ground in the county. Sir Henry had refused to sell, gently but firmly, on each of the several occasions the Duke had raised the matter, citing loyalty to tenants who had farmed that land for generations and had no wish to see it absorbed into a larger, colder enterprise. The Duke had accepted these refusals, on the surface, with the gracious patience expected of his station. Beneath that patience, however, Clara would later learn, something far less gracious had been quietly at work. Within 18 months, Sir Henry's fortunes collapsed with a suddenness that defied easy explanation. Contracts he had relied upon for years were abruptly withdrawn. Creditors who had extended him generous terms for decades suddenly demanded immediate settlement. A business partnership he had trusted implicitly dissolved amid accusations that Clara, even now, believed to be entirely fabricated. Sir Henry died within the year, his heart broken as thoroughly as his fortune, leaving Clara and her younger brother with debts that consumed nearly everything they owned, including, in the cruelest irony of all, the very river frontage land the Duke had coveted from the beginning, sold at last, under duress, to a buyer whose connection to Ashford Hall was never publicly acknowledged. Though Clara had long suspected it, she did not yet have proof of that suspicion. She would not have it for many months. What she did have, in the immediate aftermath of her father's death, was pride, a fierce and stubborn pride that refused to let the world see how thoroughly she had been broken by circumstances she barely understood. It was this pride that carried her, 3 months before the letter arrived, into a ballroom at Ashford Hall itself, invited only because her younger brother's godmother had insisted the family not disappear entirely from society despite their reduced circumstances. It was there that the Duke of Ashford, perhaps emboldened by wine or simply certain of his own irresistibility, had cornered Clara near a window overlooking his moonlit gardens and offered her, with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to women accepting whatever he chose to give them, a private arrangement that would have restored her family's finances entirely in exchange for her company, an arrangement he phrased delicately, but whose meaning was unmistakable to anyone with the wit to understand it. And Clara possessed that wit in abundance. She refused him. Not quietly, not privately, but in a voice sharp enough that 2 passing guests overheard every word, and by morning the story of Miss Winslow's refusal of the Duke of Ashford had travelled through every drawing room in the county, told alternately as an act of remarkable courage or unforgivable insolence, depending entirely on who was doing the telling. The Duke, humiliated before witnesses for perhaps the first time in his adult life, did not forgive easily. No one in society spoke of it directly to Clara's face in the weeks that followed, but she felt the shift keenly, invitations that quietly stopped arriving, acquaintances who found sudden reasons to avoid her company, a chill that settled over her family's remaining social, standing like frost over a dying garden. She understood, without needing to be told, that the Duke's revenge would come. She simply had not expected it to arrive wrapped in the paper of a gift. Holloware, when Clara finally arrived there on a bitter January afternoon, proved every bit as broken as its reputation promised. The Manor's roof had given way entirely over the old library, leaving rain and rot to work freely upon shelves of books no one had thought to save. The gardens, once laid out, according to an ancient and yellowed plan she found rolled in a drawer, with considerable elegance, had surrendered entirely to bramble and thorn. A skeleton staff remained, an elderly housekeeper named Mrs. Aldridge, whose loyalty to the property seemed to run deeper than mere employment, and a groundskeeper's son named Peter, no older than 17, who watched Clara's arrival with an expression of wary curiosity that suggested he expected her to leave again within the week. She did not yet understand why Mrs. Aldridge's loyalty ran so deep for a house that had stood empty for 20 years, nor why the old woman's eyes filled with something like grief whenever she passed the sealed door of the estate's old chapel, a small stone building at the edge of the grounds that Peter refused, under any persuasion, to enter. "It is not safe, miss," was all he would say, before finding urgent business elsewhere. Clara spent her first week at Holloware simply surveying the scope of her punishment. The estate's ledgers, what remained of them, told a story of decline that began, curiously, at almost the exact same moment her own father's fortunes had first begun to unravel. A coincidence that pricked at her attention even before she understood its significance. She found, tucked within a water-damaged account book, references to a previous owner, a Baron Thomas Ellery, whose name meant nothing to her at the time, but whose signature appeared alongside notations of debts paid, quite mysteriously, by a benefactor whose identity had been carefully scratched out of the record. No one in the house spoke of Baron Ellery directly. When Clara asked Mrs. Aldridge, who had owned Holloware before its abandonment, the old woman's face closed like a shutter, and she offered only that it was not her place to speak of old sorrows, before finding, like Peter before her, sudden and urgent reason to leave the room. It was a pattern Clara would come to recognize well over the weeks that followed, a household of quiet, careful silences, each one guarding some fragment of a larger story no one dared assemble aloud. She began, out of necessity rather than any grand design, the slow work of making Holloware livable again. She could not yet think of restoring the estate to prosperity. She thought only, in those first difficult weeks, of surviving the winter with a roof that did not leak and fields that might, come spring, yield enough to feed the household through another year. It was hard, unglamorous labour, entirely unlike the life she had once expected for herself, and there were nights, alone beside a meagre fire, with wind howling through the broken library above her, when she wondered whether the Duke had been right to believe she would fail. She did not yet understand that her survival alone was already a form of victory that gnawed at Sebastian Ashford far more than he would ever admit. The Duke visited Holloware for the first time in early February, ostensibly to inspect the condition of land that technically remained, by the careful terms of his gift, still partially under his authority until certain conditions of tenancy were satisfied, conditions Clara suspected he had invented for precisely this purpose, so that he might retain the pleasure of watching her struggle firsthand. He arrived on horseback, immaculate despite the cold, and surveyed the Manor's crumbling fade with an expression Clara could not immediately read. Not quite triumph, though she had expected triumph, but something more complicated, almost like discomfort, as though the sight of the ruin he had gifted her troubled him in ways he had not anticipated. "I confess I did not expect you to still be here, Miss Winslow," he said, dismounting with the easy grace of a man who had never in his life feared falling. "Did you expect me gone already, Your Grace, or dead?" Clara replied, and had the satisfaction of watching something flicker across his composed features, not quite guilt, but its distant cousin. He toured the grounds with her that afternoon, offering commentary that veered between cutting and, to her genuine surprise, occasionally useful. He clearly knew a great deal about land management, more than his reputation for idle cruelty had suggested, and despite herself, Clara found herself listening, cataloguing his observations even as she resented the ease with which he delivered them. It was during that walk, passing near the sealed chapel at the edge of the grounds, that she noticed his expression change entirely, the composed coldness replaced, just for a moment, by something that looked almost like pain. "You knew this place before," she said, watching him carefully, "before it belonged to your family at all." He did not answer directly. "Some houses," he said instead, after a long pause, "remember more than their owners would prefer." And then, as though regretting even that small admission, he changed the subject entirely and did not speak of the chapel again for the whole of his visit. She did not yet understand what memory that small stone building held for him, nor why a man who had shown her nothing but calculated cruelty since the moment of her refusal should, for even a single unguarded second, look at a locked door with something resembling grief. Spring brought discoveries that deepened every mystery Clara had gathered rather than resolving them. Clearing the flooded library at last, with Peter's reluctant help, she found, hidden behind a false shelf that had clearly been constructed with some care, a collection of letters bound in faded ribbon, addressed to Baron Ellery from a woman who signed herself only as your devoted E. The letters spoke of a love conducted in secret, of a marriage forbidden by family and fortune alike, and of a child, a detail that struck Clara like a physical blow, for the letters were dated barely 20 years past, well within living memory, and yet no one at Holloware, nor anywhere in the surrounding villages, had ever spoken of a child connected to this house. What remained hidden in those letters was far more dangerous than a simple tale of forbidden love. The final letter in the collection, water-stained and difficult to read, hinted at a betrayal, a family who had discovered the secret marriage and moved swiftly to erase every trace of it, separating the lovers, and the letter implied with an anguish that bled through even the faded ink. Taking the child away entirely, to be raised elsewhere under a different name, so that no scandal might ever attach itself to a family of considerable standing. Clara read that final letter 3 times before the full weight of its implication settled over her. A family of considerable standing. A secret marriage erased entirely from record. A child sent away and renamed, so thoroughly hidden that not even the house itself, in all its accumulated silences, dared speak the truth aloud. She began from that point forward to look at Sebastian Ashford with an entirely different species of scrutiny. Her suspicions found new fuel a fortnight later when a chance encounter in the village brought her into conversation with an elderly physician who had once, many years before, attended births throughout the county. When Clara mentioned Holloware and, carefully, the name of Baron Ellery, the old man's face grew troubled in a manner that told her immediately she had touched upon something significant. "Ellery," he said slowly. "I attended his wife's confinement myself, though I was sworn afterward never to speak of it. A boy, born healthy, though the mother did not survive the birth. The family that took the child in." He stopped himself abruptly, as though realizing he had already said too much, and no persuasion Clara offered could induce him to continue. She did not yet have the child's name. She did not yet understand that the boy born to Baron Ellery and his secret bride had been taken, in infancy, into a household of unimpeachable reputation, raised without ever learning the truth of his own birth, and given, by the very family responsible for erasing his origins, a name that carried considerable weight throughout the county: the name Ashford. The revelation, when it finally assembled itself fully in Clara's mind, arrived not through a single dramatic discovery, but through the patient accumulation of small, careful confirmations. A birth record in the parish register, its true entry crossed through and replaced. A portrait in Holloware's ruined gallery, bearing an unmistakable resemblance to the Duke himself, painted years before he could possibly have sat for it. Clearly, she realized with a chill, a portrait of his true father, Baron Ellery, whose blood he carried without ever knowing it. And finally, from Mrs. Aldridge herself, worn down at last by weeks of Clara's patient kindness and the housekeeper's own long-buried grief-finding, perhaps, its first safe outlet in over 2 decades, the full and unguarded truth. "The old Duke and Duchess," Mrs. Aldridge said, her voice trembling, seated beside Clara's fire on an evening when spring rain drummed steadily against the windows, could not have children of their own. It was a sorrow they carried privately for years. When word reached them of Baron Ellery's secret marriage, and the child born of it motherless and unclaimed by any family willing to raise him honestly, they saw not scandal to be punished, but opportunity to be seized. They took the boy, gave him their name, their fortune, their title in time, and never once told him the truth of where he came from. Baron Ellery, grieving and powerless against a family so far above his own station, was made to disappear from the county entirely, his own son raised as another man's heir not 2 miles from the chapel where his wife lay buried. Clara sat in stunned silence as the final pieces settled into place. Sebastian Ashford, proud, cold, certain of his own supremacy, the very man who had gifted her a broken estate to teach her the folly of defying her betters, was himself the son of a disgraced country baron and a woman erased so thoroughly from record that even her grave, Clara now understood, lay unmarked within the very chapel he could not bring himself to enter. Years later, when the full truth of that spring finally settled into the quiet legend the county would tell of it, people would say that the Duke's cruelty toward Clara Winslow had never truly been about pride, nor about her refusal of him at the ball, nor even about her father's stubborn river frontage land, that beneath all of it lay a man who had spent his entire life terrified of exactly the kind of quiet, patient scrutiny that Clara Winslow, alone among all the county's families, had finally dared to turn upon him. She did not act rashly upon this discovery, though the temptation to do so, to confront him publicly with the same humiliation he had inflicted upon her, pressed at her for days afterward. She thought instead of her father, and of the ruin that malice alone had brought upon her family, and she resolved that whatever justice this discovery afforded her, she would seek it in a manner that revealed her own character, rather than simply mirroring his cruelty back at him. She invited the Duke to Holloware directly, under the pretense of discussing the estate's tenancy conditions, and received him in the estate's small drawing room, restored now to at least a modest warmth and comfort through months of careful labour. She did not raise her voice. She did not gloat. She simply placed before him, one by one, the letters, the parish record, and finally, gently, the portrait of Baron Ellery that hung now, cleaned and restored, above the drawing-room's mantel. "I did not bring you here to destroy you, Your Grace," she said quietly, watching the colour drain slowly from his composed face as understanding dawned. "I brought you here because I believe you deserve, at least once in your life, to know the truth of where you came from, rather than have it forever weaponized by someone with less patience than I possess." The Duke's reaction, when it came, was not the cold fury Clara had half prepared herself to weather. He sat, instead, in stunned and prolonged silence, staring at the portrait above the mantel, as though seeing, for the first time, a face he had somehow always known without ever understanding why. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the icy composure that had defined every previous encounter between them. "They told me my mother died, bringing me into the world," he said quietly. "They never told me she was not truly my mother at all." What followed, over the weeks that came after, was a transformation in Sebastian Ashford that no one in the county could have predicted, least of all the man himself. The cold certainty that had defined his every public interaction, the unshakable confidence of a man who believed himself simply superior by birth to those around him, began, slowly and visibly, to crack beneath the weight of understanding that his own elevated station had been built upon an erasure as cruel as anything he had ever inflicted on another. He visited the chapel at Holloware for the first time in his memory, and stood for a long while before a small, unmarked stone that Mrs. Aldridge quietly confirmed was the resting place of Elizabeth Ellery, his true mother, dead over 2 decades, and never once mourned by the son who had grown up mere miles from her grave. He confessed to Clara, in the halting, unpracticed manner of a man unaccustomed to honesty of any real vulnerability, that he now understood, with sickening clarity, the true cause of her father's ruin. His adoptive family, having built an entire fortune and reputation upon a lie, had spent years afterward ensuring that no one connected to the truth ever gained enough standing or proximity to threaten its concealment, and Sir Henry Winslow, whose land bordered the chapel, and whose growing friendship with an elderly physician who had once attended Elizabeth Ellery's confinement, had begun, quite innocently, to draw dangerously close to the old secret. Had been destroyed not out of simple greed for his river frontage, but out of a family's desperate, generational fear of exposure. The Duke did not offer this confession as excuse. He offered it, Clara understood, as the only honest currency he possessed, the truth, finally spoken aloud, in exchange for whatever mercy she chose to extend him. She extended a great deal, though not without conditions of her own. The Ashford family's considerable resources, redirected under Sebastian's own new and hard-won resolve toward honesty, restored to Clara and her brother the river frontage land that had been so unjustly taken, along with a formal and public acknowledgement of the wrongs done to her father's memory. An acknowledgement that cost the Duke a measure of pride he had once guarded more fiercely than his own fortune, but which he offered, in the end, without hesitation. Holloware itself, no longer a punishment, but a home Clara had genuinely come to love through months of patient labour, was restored in full over the following year, its chapel unsealed at last and properly consecrated once more. Elizabeth Ellery's grave finally marked with a stone bearing her true name. The gardens, cleared of their bramble under Peter's increasingly confident hand, bloomed that summer with a fullness the old estate had not known in over 2 decades. And the estate's fields, which the Duke had once believed too broken to ever yield anything of value, produced, by autumn, a harvest that surprised every steward in the county, Clara's patient study of the old account books having revealed methods of drainage and crop rotation that Holloware's soil, rich beneath its neglect, had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to apply. Sebastian Ashford, transformed by a truth he had never sought but could not unknow, became, in the years that followed, a very different sort of Duke than the county had come to expect. Quieter, less certain of his own inherent superiority, more inclined to listen than to command. Whether that transformation constituted the lesson he had once intended to teach a young woman he believed beneath him, or the lesson she had, with patience and unshakable dignity, ultimately taught him instead, was a question the county debated for years afterward, though Clara herself, when asked, would only say that some lessons could not be taught by those who believed themselves already wise, and could only be learned by those humble enough to be broken open by the truth. A story preserved in the quiet memory of an old English estate does not always end in triumph loudly declared. Sometimes it ends in a chapel finally unsealed, a name finally restored to a forgotten grave, and 2 people who began as enemies discovering, in the slow and patient work of uncovering the truth together, something neither of them had expected to find within Holloware's broken walls. Not merely restoration of land and fortune, but the harder, rarer restoration of 2 people who had each believed, in their own separate griefs, that they had already learned everything the world had to teach them about betrayal, and found instead that the truest lesson still waited, quietly, for both of them to learn it together.